Welcome to Leading for Life Stories Season 4. I'm Bob Judson. I'm the host for this podcast, and thank you very, very much indeed for joining me. Whether you're a new joiner or a seasoned listener, then I really hope you enjoy the mix of content that we provide. The personal stories, the thematic episodes, and of course, the fantastic guest interviews. If you've been with me since the beginning, then I'm enormously grateful for your loyalty and thank you so much. If you're relatively new to the show, then I really hope you like it, and I hope you find all of it interesting and some of it hopefully useful to you. Please subscribe on whichever channel it is you're using, whether it's YouTube, whether it's a podcast platform. That really helps us boost the show and get it over the hills on the algorithms. So if you can do that for me, I would be enormously grateful. But without further ado, let's go. Welcome back, everybody. This week, my guest is Katharine Wooller. Katharine is currently the Chief Strategist in Banking and Financial Services at Softcat. She's an absolute expert on AI, blockchain, cyber. She speaks a lot. She's the chair of the Association for AI in Financial Services. And consequently, you can imagine it was a conversation that I found absolutely fascinating, not least because I learned so much. Because this is an area where, frankly, I don't really know enough. And I suspect that's true for an awful lot of people who might be listening to or watching this show. So it was a great conversation. And she's really informative, very charismatic. And I think you're going to love it. So I'm not going to spoil it any further. Off we go. Katharine, welcome to the podcast. So pleased to have you on. I'm sure it's going to be a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Not at all. You've, just looking you up, you've had an amazing career journey so far. I think just to give us a flavor of that and put some flesh on the bones initially, just talk us through your journey.
Sure. Gosh, how early did you start? So, I went to Cambridge University and read history, which is totally weird because I haven't really particularly used the subject. I've used the skills. Got myself into property to start with, then got very interested in the technology side. So I worked for an asset manager based in the Cayman Islands, which was super interesting for 7 years. Then took a little bit of a sideways step to get sort of super focused on a financial instrument, a bond. Then got into the technology, which was working for a peer-to-peer lender. Not exciting now, but was revolutionary at the time. I think I've now done, including my first job in financial services was in 2000. So I've predominantly focused on technology for financial services. So I've worked for a number of very innovative, hyperscaling, early stage businesses. And most recently, I joined Softcat PLC, which is my current role, where I'm Chief Strategist for our financial services and banking customers, about 2,000 of them. And I've also done a decade of board work, which has been super interesting, primarily helping early stage businesses. So I think fair to say, a pretty wiggly career. I always say that I started with a 7-year waitressing career whilst I was doing exams and what have you, and have ended up talking to C-suite of some of the world's biggest banks, which is over a 26-year period, been quite the journey.
Yeah, that is quite the journey, that's for sure. And we're definitely going to come back and talk about a couple of bits of that. I mean, notably Softcat, etc. I want to dive into a bit more. But before we get to that, I'm always interested in early motivations and kind of how you got to where you got to, really. So just tell us a bit more about your early life and what
Sure.
you did before you went to Cambridge and before you got
Yeah,
into
sure. So quick to check my privilege. I was very fortunate to go and be privately educated from 3 to 18, which is a huge privilege. Particularly now I've got myself children in private school and I'm not enjoying the 20% VAT addition. So I think it's very weird for me to end up in a technology related business because actually my skill set is not mathematical or sciencey. I'm actually more interested in the strategy of that technology. So my expertise is really in the bleeding edge of technology for banking from a strategic perspective. So I don't write code. No one's going to come to me to say, make that piece of software work. They will come to me to say, what do we need in our business for maximum commercial gain? So definitely sort of as a child, I was very good at assimilating huge amounts of information. So I did history at Cambridge, used to have to read 20 books a week, give or take, and then write about 7,000 words of prose and then stand in front of one of probably the world's best historians to talk about what you'd written and why. So I've always been very criminally nosy and very interested in how the world works. But my real passion was finding as much information as I could. And I always found it really hard to motivate myself to learn things I wasn't that interested in. So I've got a 13-year-old son who is desperate to give up the subjects he doesn't like, which for him is French. He really hates French lessons. And actually, I think what's great as you go through education is obviously I'm in my mid-40s, but you get to give up what you don't find interesting. And for me, I was always very interested in the world around me. So I did A-levels in history, English, philosophy, and theology. So to end up with a history degree and then in tech again is probably a bit of a leap. But the common thread for me is I'm really good at assimilating a huge amount of information, picking out patterns and what matters. So yeah, that's probably what motivated me. Oh, and I've also got a bit of an interest in horse riding. So I've horse ridden to a reasonably competitive level. And I worked out that that's not a particularly cheap hobby, and probably I should try and go and find reasonable success in a reasonably well-paid industry was probably a bit of a side motivation.
I
But
think not a particularly cheap hobby is probably a
no,
considerable understatement.
yes, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's
Um,
definitely one of those
but
expensive hobbies.
yeah, definitely. And I think lots of people say actually the lifestyle they're off that was having kids or, pursuing a sport or, they're almost sometimes their extracurricular activities almost then dictate what they want to do with their lives. For me, I've always said you could not pay me enough money to be bored. So because I'm a strategist, I do often get conversations about, oh, I come and work for this organization and you can sit in a dark room just writing decks. And I say, absolutely, that's not for me. I like being out in the industry. I was recruited from industry for my current job to bring those learnings. But actually, the best part of my life right now is that I spend pretty much all day, every day talking to CTOs and CIOs of some of the world's biggest and most complex financial services businesses. And that is the fact I get paid to do that is still a real joy and a surprise every day.
Yeah, which is always a good thing. If you and one of the things I tend to say to people when I'm doing their own training work, I do, but also my own kind of criteria of life. I've been enjoy what you do because I think
Yeah,
it's
definitely.
life's too short not
Yeah.
to do that. I
Well, you'll never have.
totally agree with you.
Yeah, you'll never have to work a day in your life if you enjoy what you do. And I think I'd be interested in your take as a coach. But to me, there's a real synchronicity between typically the things you enjoy are things you're good at, and vice versa. It's not always true. You can go and get real joy from learning to do something you're not very good at, of course. But for me, I have definitely picked the jobs and opportunities that interested me intellectually the most. And I've been very privileged to be able to make that decision based on those motivations.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, to your question, I think the horses for courses, isn't it? I mean, different people do different things. I mean, I certainly find for myself, I've always enjoyed new technical challenges. So
Yeah.
I'm going to give you, and this sounds silly as an example, but when I left the Air Force, one of the things I did was I bought a motorbike. I mean,
Oh wow.
it was a bit of an adrenaline replacement, to go and do something on the back of flying airplanes for lots of years. But also, actually, one of the things I relished doing it was the technical challenge of learning to ride it because it's not straightforward. It's not, it is a skill. And similarly, when I was doing scuba diving years ago, I got more and more into the technical elements of it, and not just because of the actual, what you saw and what you did. It was more about the actual. I loved the challenge of having to
Yeah,
upskill myself
of
constantly and
course.
so on. And
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think that is a thing for sure. But I mean, not for everybody. I mean, some people are
Yeah.
very much, more laissez-faire about it.
I think the world moves very quickly, particularly in my industry. If I was still talking about technology that's 15 years old, I wouldn't have a career, right? So I think constantly upskilling yourself is brilliant advice. I also found I'm sure we'll talk about it over the course of this interview, but there were certain points in my life where have made pivots or I've been looking for a new job. And I remember writing down a list of 20 things I could reasonably say I was okay at in a work context. And I looked at that list of 20 things and I thought, well, those 20 things make me marketable, but actually, which are the 4 or 5 that I really enjoy? So I started with a bit of sales career. I had a sort of quite a big sales team and we delivered loads. And I get all these phone calls about running big sales teams. And I'd say, look, I can do it. But I don't really enjoy it. And to be brutally honest, there's probably someone out there that will do a better job of it than me. Here are some names and some LinkedIn profiles you might want to go for. So for me, I've definitely tried to think quite hard about, yes, you can do something and you'll probably get paid for it, but is it actually the best outcome for your career and your enjoyment and your mental health? Probably not.
Yeah,
So
I
I've
totally
definitely done
agree.
that. Yeah, yeah.
I totally agree. I get exactly the same. I mean, I'm firmly at a stage of life now, a bit older than you, and I definitely, I'm into doing stuff that I enjoy, that motivates me, that I think I can genuinely deliver a good job at. And there are lots of things where I think I can deliver a good job, but I don't actually really want to do it.
Yeah, sure.
And so that doesn't mean I won't ever do it. I mean, some of the time, if it's interesting enough, I'll say, yeah, fine, all right. But I mean, or if someone's really persuasive, but often I'll be, no, yeah, do you know what? I think there are better people, exactly as you've just said.
Yeah,
And I think that's also one of the things that's important in leadership, actually, is recognizing where your talents really lie, where you can actually turn
definitely.
around and recommend other people and so on.
Yeah. And I think I think that builds credibility, right? If I phoned you and said, oh, but I'm really after X, you went, look, yeah, I could do it, but actually I'd recommend so and so. There'll almost certainly be a circumstance when that person gets called for someone that actually is better for you. I do that a lot. I do a lot of public speaking. I'm very privileged. I'm on BBC World News and I do a lot of sort of industry panel discussions and that sort of thing. And sometimes someone will see me on LinkedIn and say, come and talk about this really technical subject. And I'll say, I am conversant, but I'm not an expert. The person you want really is a CISO or a CTO. Please try these people. And I think putting out that love into the world generally comes back to you tenfold. So I'm very, very focused on the ecosystem. The financial services industry is quite insular and everyone does kind of know each other and everyone stays in it for decades. So I'm very focused on, I also chair a not-for-profit trade body for AI and banking. I really want the industry to fulfill its maximum potential, and that's its potential from a commercial perspective and the service it provides to people in the UK and further overseas. But for me, the period of my life now, I love the job I'm in, but actually it's about giving back and making a change. And again, it's been a real privilege to do that.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue into what I was going to ask you about, actually, because I did spot that, one of your current roles is as chair of the Association for AI in Financial Services and Banking. And I mean, AI dominates pretty much every conversation at the
Yeah.
minute. I mean, you
Yeah.
really can't go anywhere without people talking about AI in almost all walks of life. And so I can imagine that's a fascinating role in kind of challenging, but equally very fascinating. Tell us a bit more about your angle, what you're doing with it, where the kind of industry is going, and so on with AI.
Yeah, sure. So, as I mentioned, Softcat PLC is a FTSE listed technology business. We help our customers source, modernize, and optimize their technology. So, Softcat has thousands of clients across every vertical. I personally work on the financial services, which is about 2,000 firms. So I'm working with tier one banks, hedge funds, asset managers, big insurers, big fintechs, the full gamut really of financial services. So AI is a phenomenal opportunity, right? It's a once in a generation opportunity to derive serious efficiencies. That means efficiencies for our time in terms of productivity. So it should take out all the manky, boring admin, whether it's planning your diary or doing your expenses or doing basic research tasks or making that deck look lovely. It should free up the manky part of your day to do more interesting and more valuable work, which is wonderful. From a industry point of view, it's very much about reducing cost and risk. So the two things that financial services firms want to do quite rightly is reduce risk within the business, and that's risk in 20 different ways, and reduce costs because then in turn they can offer better prices and services to their customers. And look, Softcat does amazing work. It works with all the top vendors in the space. Nvidia, for example, is a really good one, all the big data vendors. So we're very close to what those use cases are. And I think it's a very interesting inflection point for any technology. Someone says, oh, this is a technology, whether it's putting stuff in the cloud or blockchain or AI. We come up with a new technology, and then there's a little bit of a lag when people get on board with it. So I think probably at the starting point of Chat GPT, it probably was quite niche for people that were playing with it. Now, I think a significant proportion of people do put into Chat GPT, whether it's for researching for holiday or what am I going to buy my husband for Father's Day or oh, where can I get a meal near that theatre? And by the way, we've got a gluten-free person and someone that doesn't like spicy food and someone that's pescatarian. So that curve of adoption for any technology is really interesting. So you have the early adopters, and then you have that tipping point where use of the technology is almost inevitable. And I choose my words carefully with AI because I think there is quite rightly some conversations around how we manage the ethics of AI. So things like making sure it doesn't hallucinate, making sure it's not sexist or ageist or homophobic, or all those really important things. I actually did a TED talk. I was part of a TEDx cohort that spoke about what's wrong with AI and how we fix it. You can find that by Googling my name and AI. It's available on the TED talk website. So AI is amazing. It has significant ability to deliver commercial return and significant positive impact for individuals that are in the workplace or not in the workplace. But there are some things right now that we are rightly worried about. So one of those things is the dominance of US technology, how we keep it honest. And I'm having those conversations each and every day about how we put those guardrails on. Sorry, that's a really long answer, but
No,
I
it's a
probably
really
spent
good
5 hours
answer.
talking about AI. So
Yeah, it's a really good answer, and I think, I mean, it's worth spending a bit of time on it because it is such an important topic. I mean, I think a couple of angles on this. I mean, let's take the extreme one first. I mean, on one end, it's the answer to all mankind's problems, and
yes, yeah, yeah,
on the other end, it's the end of mankind.
yeah,
And you've got
yeah,
some pretty heavyweight individuals in both camps, frankly.
sure,
And I mean, obviously, the reality is probably somewhere in the middle, but there clearly are some bigger concerns about it. And I think at the commercial level, there are some, I think, pretty legitimate concerns from people in the workplace that, my own view is, yes, fine, it's an augmentation tool for a lot of people in work, but also commercial organizations are commercial organizations. They're going to look at the bottom line. They're going to look at the P&L. If they can
yeah,
save money, and if they can save money by reducing headcount because they can automate stuff, then they're going to do it. So it
yeah,
is definitely going to have an impact in that sense on jobs and certain sectors of jobs and so on and so forth. Your perspectives on the kind of
yeah,
darker
sure.
side and also the kind of the more near term job reality
Yeah,
bit.
sure. So I think the positive slant, as I've mentioned, is it should take away the manky boring part of your job. Um, I've actually written quite a lot in the press that I personally, from the seat I sit in, have not seen mass redundancies across the financial services industry due to AI. I've done some speaking with an organization called the Financial Services Skills Commission, which looks closely and works with government and universities to talk about the skills that we need in the industry. A significant proportion retire early, so we're looking at lots of over the next decade, a significant proportion will retire and kind of who's coming through. So I haven't seen it in banking. What tends to happen in financial services is that the tenure tends to be long, and of course, salaries are high, in relative to the medium of the UK. So making people redundant in financial services is really a last resort because they hold lots of intellectual capital, they know loads from the decades there, and they're very expensive to get rid of. And of course, the human cost. Let's not ignore that. So a lot of those people are deployed. The more interesting question is how do we upskill people to make sure they're using AI properly? So often I'll hear the anecdote, oh, we've put a productivity tool in like ChatGPT, for example, or Copilot, and the uptake is really patchy, and it's patchy by age range, age groups, and it's patchy by function. So perhaps people in operations are much more keen than someone who sits in the legal department, or perhaps people, not always, but perhaps people in their 20s and 30s are more welcoming it than people in their, mid 50s to mid 60s. And the first question I ask is, oh, well, tell me about the rollout. Have you taught people how to write prompts? Because they think it's just like using Google. It's not. So I think there's some really interesting questions about how do we redeploy teams that perhaps that team was, 40 people and now it's 15. What do you do with those people? There's some very interesting questions about how we upskill people for those skills. And that's before you get near the really hardcore people that are, writing LLMs and getting this stuff up and running and keeping the guardrails for it. So it's a change. I do remember my grandmother saying to me, God rest her soul, she's been dead for decades, but she said to me in the mid-90s, I can't see computers being a thing. Because she was used to, she was the era that had a typewriter, and she was an era that would, when I was at uni, she would write me a letter every couple of days, right? So I don't recall her ever having an email account, but I do remember having a mobile phone in the early noughties that was a real novelty to her. So I think with every wave of technology, whether it was printing coming in or whether it was, the steam train coming in or electricity, there's a point at which, we have to all adapt to use it. And I think AI is that problem, but on steroids, right? So I talk about when mechanization came in, right? And we built all these amazing factories in the UK. We moved from being individual artisan workers to doing it at scale. And loads of people, particularly women, lost their jobs. So I'm very focused with AI, what groups and populations are disadvantaged by it. So I think some really interesting questions that quite rightly, deep moral questions that we should be asking ourselves.
Yeah, and just before we move off the topic completely, I mean, I'm absolutely no expert on this, but I'm paying attention to it more and more because obviously it is such a hot topic. I mean, agentic AI, where obviously it's making decisions as opposed to you just,
Yes.
I mean, I use
Yeah, yeah.
ChatGPT all the time and it's very, very clever and it does amazing
Sure.
stuff. But I think you move into the next generation of it, that's where probably legitimately people are going to have a few more questions about the ethics and morality, and where does
Sure.
it end and what impacts are going to be. Just with thoughts.
Yeah, so I think just for those people that are listening that perhaps are not totally okay with it. So the difference, so agentic AI goes off and does stuff without human interaction. So an example of that would be if I was using AI to find me a holiday based on parameters. I burn by candlelight, don't send me somewhere too hot. I do like sitting by the beach. I do like to be by the sea. The whole list of requirements. You could then say to an agent, oh, and I've already given you my passport numbers and the age of everyone in my family, and the fact we need one gluten-free meal and that we don't want to stop. We want to just fly direct. Go off and book it. So AI might get it right, but what if it gets it totally wrong and sends me to somewhere that's, 45 degrees and I'll get burnt to a cinder? So agentic AI going off and doing stuff with minimal human input is interesting. So a really good use case, for example, is in payments. You see quite a lot of agentic AI in payments. Nationwide, which is a famous UK high street bank, says it's the first high street bank to have customer-facing agentic AI. So let's just say Bob phones up and says, "I've just moved house. Please change all my address." It might be that you get into a conversation, conversational LM that then goes and does that change for you. You probably want a human in the loop for fraud checks and, oh, actually we're going to phone you and we're going to send you this letter just to make sure that that's true. If you don't send us the pin code back, we won't do it for you. So agentic AI is a huge opportunity because it should factor up your workforce. I was talking to the head of AI from a really big famous Swiss-based wealth manager, and he said it is my view that AI is a human enabler. It doesn't replace humans. There's a lot of chat around what's called humans in the loop. So maybe it does do the heavy lifting for your change of address or booking my holiday, but actually a human just looks over it to say, oh, someone's changed that to Mickey Mouse and it says that, Bob actually now lives, in, I think of something ridiculous. He's living in Outer Mongolia, and someone will go, well, that doesn't sound quite right. So that human in the loop thing is really critical. So I think we've got a lot of productivity tools, which are great. I feel like they're widely accepted. Moving to agentic AI is another level and probably the next iteration. And we're only really at the foothills of that right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I look at it through my sort of former life lens in the military, where obviously it's a very hot topic
Sure.
for all sorts of obvious reasons, and I think the guardrails, to use the term you used, are really important in that space in
Sure.
terms of how we actually control some of this, because
Yeah,
there
life and
is
death,
going,
literally. Yeah.
yeah, and there's going to become a point, which is probably not terribly far away, to be honest, where the morality of our nation, for example, or other nations that we're allied with, might be different to those that we're in in conflict with, and that's one of the big challenges as to how you manage that. Because of course, if you're working at machine speed, it's a very different thing. So no, I totally get what you're saying. It's really, really helpful. It's a conversation that I think people have got to get themselves involved with. One of the things I tend to say a lot to even senior leaders is, don't get left behind with this. Don't turn around and
Cool.
think
Yeah.
you can wait this out and it's not really going to affect you in
Yeah,
your working life. I think the pace of it is moving so quickly
definitely.
that
It's like, yeah.
you
Yeah.
cannot do that. You have to be on
Yeah.
it.
And I think it's that old adage, isn't it? Which is, and I stand by this sentence, which is AI probably won't take your job, but someone that knows how to use AI probably will. So,
Yeah,
and there's loads
that's a good point. It's a good
yeah,
statement.
and I think there's loads of resources out there. Certainly, the Association for AI and Financial Services and Banking gets together communities of practitioners. So we get together people on a peer-to-peer basis under Chatham House rules to say, great, you're an insurer. How have you fixed that? Brilliant. You work at an asset manager. You work in compliance. What are your use cases? And I've really enjoyed bringing those communities together on a thought leadership basis, because I think
Nice.
we have to share that knowledge, and I think particularly one that's perhaps a little bit scared of AI, I think embracing it and also knowing what its limitations are, right? And I think from a regulatory point, I'm very interested in regulation. So within financial services in the UK, there are no specific rules about AI, right? So the regulator said, we won't give you any new rules, you're just going to have to comply with the rules that are there. So this is a massive simplification for the case of time, so forgive me, but those rules are essentially based on treating customers fairly and making sure there is no systemic vulnerabilities, right? So working out how AI fits into that is inherently challenging. In Europe, there are something called the EU AI Act, which sets out some really firm requirements for how you use AI and indeed singles out financial services as particularly high risk. So that regulation in Europe has come in kind of in phases. So we're only early stage. So we haven't seen any, to my knowledge, big fines or anything. So if you remember when GDPR came in, lots of changes in the technology of lots of different verticals. And it took a little while for those big fines to come in where people have breached those rules. But particularly if you look at, and forgive me, these are not verticals that I personally work in, but the application of AI for, as you say, defense or healthcare and banking, these are all, really there's risk there that clearly needs to be managed and thought deeply about.
100%. Before we move into sort of back to you and leadership specifically, you mentioned the word a minute ago, but blockchain is a
Yes.
word that seems to feature a lot in people's vocabulary in your kind of space, and it's a term that I hear a lot, and I have to say I shamelessly confess it totally baffles me still, some of the detail around this. Can you unpack some of that in a
Yeah, sure.
simplistic way for simple souls like me as to what it is, what it's going to do,
Sure.
pluses and minuses?
Yeah, of course. So blockchain, very simply, is the ability to hold data in a decentralized fashion. So in the old days, data would stay in one place, so that it would stay on a database, and you would ping it for information. The idea of blockchain is that the information is held across the users. So you each hold a little bit of it essentially, and critically, you agree by consensus. So the reason that's important is it's immutable. So perhaps you're in a country where data is what's the word, can be swayed by government policy or government intervention. Perhaps you feel it's more democratic for that information to be held across a broader group of people. It means no one person or entity can have control essentially. So it's a completely new way of thinking about data. It is also the underlying technology for cryptocurrency. So you often people kind of sometimes struggle to tell the difference. So blockchain can be used for data in all sorts of different contexts, whether it's healthcare or decentralizing the power for infrastructure. I could write you 100 use cases. Unfortunately, what people mostly know about is cryptocurrency. And I think I personally have had involvement in blockchain for the last 7 years or so. So I was on board really early. Sometimes the conversations about blockchain get really caught up in, well, I don't feel comfortable buying Bitcoin. That's fine. You don't need to buy Bitcoin to know a bit about blockchain. So a lot of the birthplace of that industry was speculative investment in cryptocurrencies. Some have done really well. The vast majority, unfortunately, have not done well, and there was lots of scams and hacks and all sorts of very negative headlines. So if you look at the early days, it was very much speculative investing, and people were mining Bitcoin and these big server farms or mining it in their own houses. What's happened now is that blockchain is a really critical technology to lots of industries and also lots of financial services. And interestingly, lots of financial, really well-known big businesses either trade it or they hold it. And even, some quite mainstream businesses like PayPal or Revolut, you can actually transact crypto through them. So yeah, it's hard to condense 7 years of what's happened in the industry, but a very interesting technology that I expect to hear more of. I think one of the things you'll hear a lot about in the next couple of years is what's called, a bit of a mouthful, sorry, the tokenization of real world assets, which is a very posh way of saying taking something, breaking it down into tiny little pieces. So you might want to buy an 100 quid share in a house, or you might want to try and tokenize traditionally very illiquid assets to let people trade them. And there's likely to be trillions of dollars worth of assets tokenized because essentially you can, at the moment, it takes between 2 hours and a day to settle a payment. So I send Bob a tenner, the bank will say within 2 hours, yes, we've got that tenner, or perhaps it'll be overnight if your banking doesn't have faster payments. The likelihood is that most of the banking infrastructure at some point will use blockchain to do near instantaneous settlement. So that's really important for things like international FX. So if you're trying to get from, British pounds to American dollars or euros or whatever. So it will drive huge efficiencies for banks. So it's highly likely that the average person will be using blockchain infrastructure within their financial services products without even knowing about it, because it's faster, quicker, easier, cheaper way of moving money. So you'll probably be using it without even noticing. Even if you say, don't give me a Bitcoin, it's not my cup of tea, it will be part of our financial furniture in the reasonably near future.
Nice. You're welcome to send me a tenner anytime you like, by the way.
Oh, thanks. Good to know. I've been noted.
uh, Brilliant. So, I mean, that's a really helpful setup as well for your kind of deeper background and where your expertise lies. But leadership's at the heart of this podcast, and I'm always interested in individuals' leadership journeys, not only your personal journey, and you've clearly gone a long way up the leadership ladder. You've, I guess, learned a lot along the way and seen lots of different things, but also your kind of experiences of other leaders and good, bad, and ugly, as it were. Just your big takeaways.
Yeah, sure. So I think you learn so much about being managed by someone you don't like or don't necessarily appreciate their management style. So I've had some amazing bosses that you're in touch with like decades later. And I don't mean like because you're on the scrounge for a reference. I mean, you're still asking for their opinion about stuff or staying in touch with them. So I've tried to take the best bits of bosses I've really enjoyed and hopefully learn a lot from the ones that I don't. So the best bosses are empowering and, take you on a journey and work collaboratively and, you know, let you have a level of autonomy and everyone has, good fun and everyone can come up with ideas. That's kind of the good bits that I've picked up. I've had some really horrible, hideous, micromanaging internal politics, um, what's the word, really aggressive, very erratic temperament wise. I'm trying to think what else annoys me. Very ego driven, really like belittling people. Yeah, I've had some I've been privileged to have some amazing bosses, and I have not enjoyed the ones that were not so great, but they have taught me a lot. And I'm very flattered that occasionally people phone me up and say, oh, I'm thinking about a job move. I've worked for you before. I'd love to work for you again. That's a real compliment actually. So I try and be the boss that I would like to have, I think. And that's easier to do if you do your own recruiting. Sometimes if you join an organization, you inherit a team. I actually don't have any headcount at Softcat, which has been again really unusual and quite a surprise. But if you inherit a team, you haven't always picked those personalities. Whereas when I'm doing my own recruitment and I have a say in who comes on board, I'm very focused on the health of a team and how that team dynamic works. But I do appreciate that only works if I've been first on the ground a few times for a few businesses, so I've been able to do that. But ideally try and hire people that their management style suits you and vice versa.
Yeah, no, let's just unpack that a little bit because I think that I totally get that. I'm the same. You develop your leadership style over years by looking at people that you like and looking at people you don't like and not doing the latter and doing the former and picking up some of those traits. So what kind of things are important to you? I mean, for yourself in terms of your own behavior, but what are you looking for in your team when you're building a
Yeah,
team,
sure.
for example? What kind of traits matter?
Yeah, so I think one of the things I live by is whether I'm interviewing to work somewhere or I'm interviewing people, um, there will be people that you encounter in that scenario where, to be really blunt, you're going to have to spend more time with that person than your own spouse. And obviously, you had hopefully significant input in finding your own spouse. So I'm always thinking, how would I feel if I had to sit next to you all day, every day? And how would you feel about that, right? So that's it. And we don't want to just recruit in our own image and have a whole bunch of clones. You, of course, need diversity of in everything, age, gender, religious background, socioeconomic background. I want a true diverse team, but there's got to be some commonality that pulls that together. And I've sat in some amazing teams which have a huge variety in terms of the types of personality, but really good managers. So I think for me, it's really about having a healthy team, and that's not about what I think should happen and recruiting in my own image. I think it's about always thinking about that team dynamic and what you have to achieve together. And I think the health of the team, I think, is probably paramount when I'm out and thinking about who should be recruited and what seat they should sit on the bus.
Nice. Okay, that's really, really, really interesting. I mean, when you look backwards to looking across your career of really you said 26 years or something you said a minute ago.
Yeah, my first job in banking.
What if you were looking back with the benefit of hindsight and you were advising an 18-year-old who's about an 18-year-old you that's about to enter the workplace now, so with today's lens,
Wow.
what would
Yes.
what
Wow.
would you be saying? What advice would you be offering?
Oh gosh, I think about this a lot. I've got two kids that are 4 and 13, so obviously a big gap. One just started primary school, one a little bit of a way through secondary school. I would not want to be a young person today. I think it's super tough. I think there are a whole bunch of economic pressures, societal pressures. I think, I mean, there's lots of chat in the press about how many of our young people are NEETs, so not in education, or employment or any sort of training. So I do think it's super tough, particularly in mental health. The day that we are recording this podcast, yesterday they produced the ban for under 16s on social media. My 30-year-old doesn't have social media. So I think it's super tough for young people. So I think the only advice I could probably give someone in good conscience now, and it's advice I give both of my children every day, is do your absolute best. Anything else is selling yourself short, and choose what interests you, which I know I've already said once in this podcast. But I think, if you look at things like the levels of student debt that these young people take on, and the competition for jobs. I mean, Softcat has an amazing grad program, an amazing apprenticeship program. I'm always really inspired by the people that come through it. But I think it's super challenging for young people. I'm very focused on getting more underrepresented groups into both banking and STEM subjects. I'm active in lots of DEI initiatives. So anything that differentiates yourself, I think is a really good thing. So I think really hard up what you want to do and where you want to get to. Do your best to get there, and do everything you can outside of your studies and in terms of building your network. I think that's probably what you can do at the moment.
Yeah, it's a really good answer. I think the interesting that differentiation point I think is so important. I mean, I think being interesting as a person, is so important. Just not least to get yourself in the door, so that people actually
Definitely.
just go, you're not, some cookie cutter from somewhere else. You actually do have something about you that I like, and I want to
Sure.
turn around and explore a bit further. So no, I think that's great advice.
So I've been recently doing some informal mentoring of an amazing young woman who is predicted at A levels A star, which didn't even exist when I was doing my levels. And she's interested in reading PPE at Oxford. And despite her straight A's, was told, look, everyone's going to an interview and say, I'm interested in the subject. What else can you go and do? And I've organised for her to have some work experience at a massive pensions firm. And then she's had a working interview from someone at one of the world's biggest asset managers. And I'm going to give her some work experience at the trade body. She will be able to sit in that interview and have three things that probably her competitors and her peers won't have. So I think it's really important for people that are in privileged leadership positions to give back. So my personal commitment is, if anyone gets hold of me over LinkedIn and says, is there any chance you could support me on X? As long as I can physically do it and it's reasonable, ethical and legal, I will do so. Because if you are in a position of seniority and you've had the privilege of the industry being kind to you, it is important for the industry to get the next generation in, and also it's a bit of giving back. So I'll get off my soapbox, but I feel very strong about that. In any industry, you should be giving back to the next generation.
No, it's a great soapbox. I totally agree with you. I think it's a very, very important feature of leadership that you do exactly that. I always talk about highs and lows, and try and pick up on highs and lows of my guests, and inevitably, pretty much everyone has some. I mean, professional high for you, what's your high point?
Oh goodness, that's a really good question. So I'm really enjoying working in the FTSE. That's relatively recent to me. As I mentioned already, Softcat has amazing customers, and we work with some amazing people. So that has been a real privilege. I've really enjoyed the board work. To be advising early stage hyperscaling businesses has been phenomenal fun. I know you're not supposed to say you have great fun at work, but I absolutely do every day, which makes the days go faster. So I'd say that's probably a high. My TED talk was on the bucket list for me. So I did that back end of last year, autumn last year. So that was amazing. And I do have, so I'm a big believer that if your goals, you should have a hairy, audacious goal, right? And so I'm working towards a couple of those, which maybe I'll come back on in a couple of years' time and tell you whether I've achieved them. So there's a few broadly industry related things that I'm keen to achieve via the trade body. So I will come back and talk to you as and when those happen. So that's definitely the high. The lows, I have been made redundant before, so that is really tough. You're always told that it's not personal and it's just business. And I'm not I'm not sure I buy into that. It does feel quite personal when you're worried about feeding your kids and keeping a roof over your head. So being made redundant, although I could totally see why the business made those decisions, obviously is a real concern. So I've had some periods of job hunting, which are horrible. You wouldn't wish that on your worst enemy. And again, why if someone says I'm job hunting, any suggestions in your network that's useful, I always take those calls if I can. And also I've been in teams where I have managed a team where redundancy is happening. So having to go through that process of making people redundant that you really like. Personally, you absolutely love their company. they're good at their jobs, but just the business needs have changed. I found that really challenging on an emotional. And again, you're not supposed to talk about emotion at work, but I found that emotionally challenging. And I think you learn a lot about yourself having to go through that process as a manager, and just being as supportive and as, well, I'm trying to think of the right word. Going through that process with dignity on behalf of those people was something I was surprised how hard it was the first time I had to do it.
Yeah, I think people stuff is always tough, isn't it? Whether it's, dealing with them on a personal level with some kind of drama that's gone on in their personal life. My old life, obviously, occasionally we lost people, which was a real drama. Whether obviously you've got to deal with the aftermath of that. It's absolutely tragic, and it is tough. And I think interesting your point about not being too happy at work and not being too emotional at work. I mean, I think we've moved societally, haven't we, in an interesting way here, but where I think that certainly 30 years ago or more, that was definitely the case. You were, you need to be fairly bland about your approach. Whereas
Yeah.
actually, I think now, if you're a good leader, you do have some emotions. I'm not
Yeah.
suggesting it floods of tears every day, but you definitely, it's inappropriate to not be visibly moved by some things, and equally happy by things, and being cheerful by
Yeah.
about things that go on, and
And
saying
I
thank you
think
to
like
people.
you, I feel I've been interested in your take coming from a military background, which is so different to what I do for a day job. I do feel that over the last, particularly 5 years, there's a real sense of, like you say, you can be more emotional at work, and I think there's a real sense of a leader of authentic leadership. So bringing your full sense, um, your full personality, for want of a better word. And of course, we have to be professional, and of course, there's lots of rules around the workplace which should rightly be there, but I feel like there's a lot more diversity of personality, and that you can bring more of your authentic self to work. And as long as that's in the right context, generally that's a good thing. And I think that has coincided rightly and very positively with a lot of the chat around the neurodiverse in the workplace, and some one of their all the things they offer, and so loads of their many superpowers. And I think in technology, I don't think it would be unfair or unkind to say there is a reasonable portion of neurodiverse people. But I just feel like there is a bit more personality and bringing your authentic self today that wasn't there 5, 10, 15 years ago.
Mm. No, I completely agree. Actually, another nice segue, actually, because I always like to talk about, people who are in stressful jobs, busy jobs, what they do to kind of relieve some of that. I mean, you've talked about horse riding. You've always got
Yes.
kids as well, which I guess keep you busy.
Yes.
What else do you do?
Oh, that's enough, I think. Because I love animals. One of my life ambitions is to be significantly unbusy to justify having myself a dog. I've wanted a Dalmatian for about 42 years, so that is my semi-retirement goal. One of my goals is to have a Dalmatian and to be able to walk it miles every day. So I love spending time in nature. I love animals. Your horse doesn't care whether you've had an amazing day or a dreadful day. I've competed my horses, so that's been a real source of joy. And like with many sports, you have to get 100 things right to turn up on the day and deliver a good performance. So that's been amazing. I've met some of my greatest friends through the horse riding, which is fantastic. But just it's one of those things you can do and no one can bother you on the phone, because if you're on a horse, galloping around at 30 odd miles, you can't pick up the phone or check your team's messages. So that's helped. So I've ridden pretty much all of my life. I've ridden most of my working life, not at the beginning when I was trying to get my career up and running and have enough disposable income to be able to have a toe in it. So that's been amazing. I've tried to keep myself relatively fit. I'm unfortunately injured at the moment. I've done some marathon running, which again, I always argue makes me better at your job for me personally, because again, it's long campaigns of getting a really firm strategy and sticking to it. Carrying out my kids is a joy, because they don't really care if you've had an important posh meeting or done something amazing at work. They just don't care. They just want to go to the park or talk to you about Minecraft. So I really like the variety, which has been amazing. So yeah, that's probably enough on top of a chunky day job and a couple of board roles.
Yeah, no, I would say that's pretty good. No, nice. It's really, really helpful. I'm very conscious of your time, and there's two questions though that I always ask at the end of these. The first is, what's the most memorable event of your professional life so far?
Oh goodness, most memorable event. That's a really good question. So the first one I went on BBC World News was amazing. So I've been on I get asked to talk on, so BBC World News, I understand, has got up to 300 million people watching it. And I have been very lucky to go on a number of times to talk about financial technology, specifically blockchain. So the first time I did it, I'm actually sitting in my home office, but I do it from the end of my dining room. And at the time, my younger son was probably about 18 months old, and I'm normally on the breakfast business news. So you get up at 4:30, you sound check at about 5:15, you go on about 5:30. And I was just praying that my son wouldn't walk in the room, which of course has already happened. Someone was doing an interview as a subject matter expert and someone walked in. So the first time I did that, the adrenaline was so massive, and I was so flattered to be perceived to know enough about my industry that I could talk knowledgeably about it. So for me, when I go on the BBC World News, I'm given the theme of the questions, but not the exact questions. So again, the adrenaline to think on your feet if they start you to tweak a question. And also, unlike today, where I can see your body language and you're nodding, and I think I'm roughly talking sense, you can't see any
No
body
clue.
language at all,
Yeah.
which is really tough. So I think the first time I went on BBC World News, I was so proud to fly the flag of the industry and to have the expertise that I was allowed, that I was asked. So it's a bit of a, it was a couple of years ago now, but and I do remember, I'm sorry, this is a real aside, but I remember going on, I think on Boxing Day, certainly between the Christmas and New Year period, which every year they do like a look back at the year and the themes, a retrospective for the year. And I had just bought my older son a Switch, so it must have been a few years ago. And if you're on the news, you obviously can't have it playing in the house because it will, you'll feedback and what have you. So I went and set up at opposite ends of the house, and I did my interview, and the journalist had gone, and I came back in, and I said to the assorted family that were at my house for the Christmas period, "What did you think?" And a few people, "Oh, well done," and "Oh, good," and it all sounded fine. And my son looked up and went, "Oh, sorry, mummy, I was playing my Switch," because he just didn't care, had no interest at all in what I had to say. Anyway, so that goes back to kids really keeping your feet on the ground, don't they?
Yeah, keep you grounded. That's for sure.
Yeah.
No, the questions thing's interesting as well. I've done a bunch of media over the years, and the and down the line stuff and all the rest of it. And I remember vividly talking. We were doing ops over Bosnia, and I was actually back in the UK where we were talking to the to Sky News. It was an interview with Sky News where the siege of Sarajevo was going on, and they were saying, right, we our footprint covers former Yugoslavia. You need to be aware of that. I said, yeah, no, I get that. I understand that. We've got Sky. And we're not going to ask you anything controversial. We want it to be completely, kind of upbeat. And I said, okay, fine, yeah, that's
Upbeat.
all.
Wow, that's a challenge when discussing, yeah, advanced
Exactly.
defense.
And so question two of this interview, because this conversation was with the guy on the ground, but that wasn't the anchor back in the studio, right? Question two was, how are you going to avoid inflicting civilian casualties if you have to carry out bombing raids around Sarajevo? And I'm going, through my mind is going, nothing controversial, eh? And of
And
course,
what
the
did you say?
training we get
Yeah, of
was,
course. Yeah,
what you should ordinarily do is, if it's a taped interview, you say, look, I'm sorry, we agreed that's
can't answer
outside the
that.
scope of
Yeah,
the interview. I'm not going to
yeah,
talk
of
about that.
course. Yeah,
But you can't do that on a live interview. You just got to deal with it. And I did, and it was all right. I mean, I basically said, we can't, we can't
yeah,
guarantee that. What I can tell you is
yeah, of course.
everything we do is designed to avoid that.
Yeah,
But
and
yeah,
I think
it's
I
fascinating.
would put another answer on that is that a real privilege to look at. Obviously, I can't talk about specific clients, but you end up for anyone, you end up on a project at work or working with a specific client, or your team achieves something. I love to look at that and think, oh my goodness, 6 months or a year ago, I wouldn't have even dreamed X could happen. Or looking back and think, do you remember we were so excited when X happened? But actually, that now happens weekly. Do you know what I mean? So I think just looking back and seeing the growth, and it's really hard to pick out specific examples. Obviously, we sign NDAs quite rightly with our customers, but there was just kind of like things that you get to go to, or people you get to speak to, or projects you get to go on, and you think, crikey, do you know what? I've done all right, or the team, like our team's done really well this week. And I think to take stock of when things go well is a real joy and a privilege.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. Hey, very last question before you go.
Sure.
What's the most difficult question you've ever been asked?
This is brilliant for interviews, right? So if you have to interview anybody, so it's really like, what's your biggest weakness? And everyone always goes, oh, I'm a perfectionist, and I give myself a hard time. It's like, yeah, but you've just Googled that, so that's a really good answer. Someone once said to me, what's your biggest mistake? And I thought that was such a good question, because how personal do you get? So do you say, oh, well, it was my first marriage, or I regret, whatever. So I just thought it was such a good question in terms of looking inwards. And I think it's quite a personal question because like work-wise, I've had a few jobs I've gone to and thought, this isn't as advertised, this is an absolute this is a disaster. That doesn't tell you very much. It just means that something was sold to you in the interview, you joined it and it didn't work. That doesn't tell me anything about you. When someone says, what personally is your greatest regret or your greatest mistake? That is it's a really personal question. And it's actually the other side of what are you most proud of? But it was one of those questions. If you can, in an interview, make someone stop and think, you're like, oh. And I actually said to the guy, I said, I'm stealing that. If I don't end up working here, that's fine. I'm stealing that question. So yeah, a brilliant question if you're interviewing. What's your biggest regret or what was your biggest mistake? You'll always find something interesting.
Nice. Katharine, thank you very much indeed. I know you've got to run, but really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
All the best. Bye-bye. I really hope you've enjoyed this conversation with Katharine. I thought it was great insights into a complex and challenging but increasingly important world, and one that we all need to kind of upskill ourselves on, particularly around the AI piece, the blockchain piece and so on. It's buzzwords that are trotted out all the time, but actually understanding what they really mean, where it's going to go, what's going to matter from that, I think is vitally important. So I hope you found that useful. If you did, then please, as always, share it, repost it, comment on my LinkedIn posts, etc., and push that out so we widen the access and get it to the biggest possible audience, which would be really, really helpful. If you find it valuable, then please do think about that bit of value for value and go to my Patreon site via the support the show link in the podcast platform or in YouTube, and you'll find the opportunity there to join as a supporter, a champion, or a patron of the show. Any one of which won't cost you a lot of money, but it'll certainly make a very big difference to what I do. So I would love it if you would be up for doing a bit of that and just helping me move this along a little. But either way, as I always say, I'm delighted to have you here. Thanks very much indeed for watching and or listening, and see you soon. Thanks. Bye now.